Okay, this is Chris Goldthorpe, your Scholastic chess coach, and this is what would normally be the second lesson in a weekly 1 hour after-school chess program for a teacher who was maybe a little bit less experienced at teaching chess. This one is going to seem a little bit boring to beginners because the application for it is not obvious yet. This is what learning to read is to learning in general, because this is chess notation, the language of chess. So it might not be clear to young, inexperienced students, why do we need to learn this? Well, this is the way that we communicate about the chessboard in the moves. So it's a coordinate system with numbers and letters describing each square. This is E3, this square right here. So this is a list of moves in a game. So this is like D4, knight F6. We're going to learn this and come back to it. But this is how moves are described, or positions on a chessboard are described. Chess notation. This is so-called algebraic notation. I'm not going to talk about descriptive notation in this video, but I will comment that descriptive notation is better for talking about chess, and algebraic notation, the type we see here, is better for writing your moves down because you have less to write typically. So the first step in chess notation is to learn the chessboard, which, as you can see here, is numbered 1 through 8, starting on white's back rank and moving toward black's back rank. So black pieces are on the higher numbers. When you set up a chessboard, the queens are on the letter D, and each queen is on its own color. So if the queen cannot be both on the letter D and on its own color, if it cannot be both, that means you're trying to set up the white pieces on the black side. So we see at the very beginning of the game that the knights are on B and G. The king and queen are on D and E. The rooks are on A and H. And the bishops are on C and F. And since this is a video, you can go back and play that over and over again. So what square is this? If you're not sure, you look at the letter of the file it's in. The files are the vertical columns, and the rank that it's on. The ranks are these horizontal rows, each one with a number. So this is D5. So the square here would be F3. So one of our first tasks is to become familiar enough with the chessboard that even without coloration and letters and numbers, we can identify the squares. So let's get ready to do that. First, we have a numbered blank board here. Now, when the pieces were set up, do you remember which pieces were on the A and the H file? They were the rooks. As this may come before we even learn about the pieces or setting up the board, we're going to leave that till later. If you don't already know that B and G files are where the knights belong, and C and F are where the bishops belong. The queen is on D, the king is on E, and the pawns are in front of these pieces. So we have pawns in every file, on the 2nd rank and on the 7th rank at the beginning of the game. But for now, let's just try to get familiar with the letters and numbers of the different squares here. So E, F, G, and H are on the right side of the board. Later on, we'll call that the king's side of the board. When you are the white pieces, your king side is to your right. But if you were to stand up and walk around over to this side so that you were looking down here, you would see that when you're the black pieces, it's your queen side ABCD, which is on your right. So this square would be what? What letter? What number? And in a description of a square, the letter always comes first. So this is E4, the square right here. The square right here would be D5. So in order to drill yourself and get very familiar with it, I would recommend that you start off with one quadrant of the board only. And at first, don't even worry about identifying the square. Just know which rank it's in. So which rank is this square in? The 6. See the 6 over here? What rank is this square in? 7. What about this one? 5. What about this one? 8. How about here? 6. 7. 5. 7. 5. 6. 7. 8. 6. The last row is 8, so of course right next to it is 7, and 2 away is 6. 5 are the squares just barely into black's half of the board. Now we're only going to worry about the letters. Now when you practice this, you might spend, at least the first time, a lot more time on it. This time, only try to identify which file it's in, the letter. So this is E. This is G. This is F. This is H. This is F. This is G. E. G. F. E. G. H. F. G. E. G. E. F. H. So we come to know the E is like right next to the center. F is in this line. G is right next to the edge. H is along the edge. So when we look at a square, until we've learned the names of the squares, we've already learned the files and the ranks. So when we look at the square, if we don't recognize it as F6, we know it's in F, then we know it's in 6, and then we go F6. This is G7. This is E8. G8, F6, G7, E5, H8. And so you make yourself very familiar with this quadrant, and then whichever quadrant we start with, you take a diagonally opposite one, because then you're learning the other 4 files and the other 4 ranks. So we do a similar quiz in this one. You just pick squares randomly and only worry about what file it's in. Then the same thing, you only worry about what rank it's in, and then finally try to identify the square immediately. Now when you can do that, come back to one of the quadrants you haven't covered and have somebody else just say the name of a square in that quadrant, and you should be able to find it immediately. In other words, you're going the other way around. From a square to a description, you're going from the description to where is it. So if I say D5, it's here. If I say B7, you go B7, it's here. So on Lichess.org, which is a great resource, we can see a sort of like a puzzle page that does for us. And when you get to Lichess, go to Learn Coordinates. For the time being, I would not use the name square one. Now we're going to find the square. You can start by looking for the square from white's perspective only at first, then from black, and then finally do it where it's random. So I'm going to start with the one that's on white, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, see how much you can follow. Okay, so we're going to say start. E4, C1, B3, A2, G5, F4, D2, C3, A4, G6, E1, B4, G6, B3, G1, A1, E5, G1, A7, A6, B2, F3, B1. Okay. Now, if you get 10 within the 30 seconds, you're doing well. And now let's try it from the black side. So A starts over here. We're looking at it from the other side of the board. This is A1. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. A, B, C, D like this. So this square is D4. So now we'll try it from here. H4, G1, E7, G8, D3, H2, E5, D5, C2, B3, A8, F4, G1, D4, E5, C2, H3, G5, H6, A8, F4, A7. Okay, 21. Okay, and then you got the idea. You can try it with the king on either color. Now, if you're just watching this video for the first time, you may feel like, oh, I understand this, but you probably still don't have the board memorized. And there is a difference, and it is important, because if we're looking at a complicated position and we're trying to talk about it, let's say we go down to here and we're saying, well, if bishop takes f4, g takes f4, then we've got queen takes a5. Now, if you're having to take a couple of seconds to find each one, you're not going to be able to remember ahead. I was just talking about if the bishop took here and then this pawn took back, then the queen would be able to take the queen. So hopefully you can see the value in being able to do it quickly and the importance of really having it memorized. Also, when you play in a tournament game, you need to write your moves down. It's very valuable to be able to do that. Not just to review your games, but to protect yourself against errors. You know, your opponent may say that you made a different move than you did, and they might not be intentionally misleading anybody, but they made a mistake. Or you may want to prove a threefold repetition. So if you have a trainer and you want to review the games with your trainer, you can't do that very well if you're not very good at writing your moves down. So it doesn't take a lot of errors on a score sheet to make the game incomprehensible. So going back to an image of a chessboard, after you do this, let's try to get to the point where you can do it. Maybe you have a wooden chessboard. Maybe you have a wooden chessboard at home that doesn't have any notation on it. Now, is it still easy to know that this is D4? So when you're trying to practice, you randomly pick a square. Let's suppose you pick this square. If you don't know right away that that's F5, at first make a guess and then verify it. So that you start over here. If this is the white side of the board, you go A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay, it was in this line, so the letter was F. Now this is F1, F2, F3, F4, F5. So if you thought of something other than F5, you have the chance to correct yourself. How do you know if a square is light or dark? And it makes a difference. Light square bishop can never go to a dark square. A knight switches color every time he moves. Well, it's simple. If you add up the order of the letter in the alphabet, for instance, A is 1, B is 2, H is 8. If you take the letter and the number and you add them together, if they are an odd number, and only if they are an odd number, the square is white. For example, H1. H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. 8 plus 1 is equal to 9. 9 is an odd number, and look, it's a white square. Look at E2. E is the 5th letter of the alphabet. So E5 plus 2 is 7. 7 is odd, so E2 is a white square. D4. D is the 4th letter of the alphabet, and so we have 4 plus 4 is 8. Even number, dark square. So what square is this one? C6. What square is this? F7. What square is this? C2. How about this one? B3. How about this one? B6. What about this one? C7. How about this square? G6. And this is G3, and that's F2. So the next goal is to be able to do it on a board like this. And finally, if you're really good at it, you should be able to use a board that has wow, let's see, is it saved? A board with without color. Okay, which is harder. This square would be E6. That would be G7. This one would be F5. This would be F4. That would be E3. That's D3. This is C4. And again, this is from white's side of the board. When you get to where you can do it from white's side of the board, then pretend you're on black side of the board. Okay, so that would be H7. That would be G6. This would be A7. That would be E4. And then this would be D5 if black is on this side. So once you have the chessboard memorized, then what you need to know is how to write down movements, which are from square and then a to square. So for example, if a piece went from G1 to F3, you could do like this, G1 dash F3. If something went from D7 to D5, you can go like this. Now, if you wanted to be sure to make it easy to know what piece moved, you could precede this with a capital letter. For instance, white's first move here might have been knight G1 to F3. When you have a pawn move, you don't need to put a capital P. This adds nothing. So it's not necessary, and yes, it's wrong. Don't do it. 2. Let's suppose now he goes G2 to G3, and he goes knight G8 to F6, and so on. You could write the game this way, and sometimes beginners are encouraged to do so. And really it just helps you to learn the chessboard, because now you've got two squares to identify. But that does make it a little bit harder, and it's not always Usually it's not necessary. So the short form is to just do it this way. When a pawn moves, you only write down the square that it finishes at. Where did it go to? Because there will always be only one pawn that can get there. There was only one knight that could go to f3, so we can just say knight f3. By the way, the king is greedy, so he used the K that the knight wanted to use. So we use an N for knight, and a K is for king. Q is for the queen. If you move a piece that's not a pawn, you start with a capital letter. Any move that's not a pawn move begins with a capital letter. If it's a pawn move, it does not. All pawn moves start with a lowercase letter, so any move that starts with a lowercase letter is a pawn move. So instead of long form algebraic, which is the type with the to and from square, we can just use straight algebraic notation like this. And it's a little bit easier. It's less to write. So the way you read this is you say knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6. When you say a pawn move, you only say the name of the square that the pawn moved to. When you say a move that's not a pawn move, you just say the name of the unit that moved and the square it got to. So this is knight f3. So let's take a look at this game here. Go all the way back to the beginning. Okay, it says d4. So here's d and here's 4. But it starts with a lowercase letter. That means a pawn moves there. There's only one pawn that can go there. So that would be this move. Now black's move number 1, which is always to the right of white's move, says knight f6. Here is the F file. And here's the 6th rank. So knight f6 would be to move a knight to f6. If you simply wrote down f6, that would indicate this pawn moving here, which besides not being a good move, it's not the move that black made. Here white played knight to c3. It's not a pawn move because it starts with a capital letter. First find the file, then find the square. c3 is here. Then we see which knight can go there, and then we know that it was this move. In the beginning, when you're using notation, it might seem a little bit awkward, and you might feel like, well, who needs this anyway? You do. If you're ever going to get even a little bit good at chess, this is the way we talk about chess, and it makes it a lot easier in the long run to learn. Every single chess book that describes any sequence of moves will use some sort of a notation system. And there aren't very many books now that are so old that they use something called descriptive notation, which, like I said, I'm not going to talk about that much here. So this is how to get started on chess notation. And if you have a teacher helping you, they should hopefully quiz you to the point where they know that every single one of you knows how to write chess notation. Maybe when you begin a game, if you just write the first 6 moves of the game. Now remember, when you're writing down a game, you write down your moves, but you also write down your opponent's moves, even though they are doing the same thing. You should not both write and then switch papers to write in the other person's moves. That's bad practice. So if you were the white pieces and you were playing this game, you would be writing all of these moves. If you were the black pieces and you were playing this game, you would be writing both white and black's moves as well, and in the same way. So that your score sheet would look just like theirs, and that's what it's called, a score sheet. This is what's called the score of the game. So it goes all the way down, and at some point, the game is over. So, do you see what square the white king is on? He's on f3. And black's last move was bishop takes b4. He took this pawn. That's what the X means, a capture. When you castle, you write that down as 0-0. Let's see if there was any castling in this game. Actually, there was none. No castling. Yeah, no castling, which is unusual. Okay, so I would call this lesson number 2, and we want to remember that the ranks are the horizontal rows that are with numbers. Files are the vertical, straight up and down with letters. Columns. Diagonals are named by the end squares against the edge of the board. And when we write down a move that's not a pawn move, we start with a capital letter based on which piece moved, and then we write the square that it moved to. Now later on we'll learn about a special way to write a move when two pieces of the same kind are both able to go to one and the same square. That only happens with knights, rooks, and occasionally with queens if you have more than one. We'll see you in the next video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and tell your chess teacher at your school to make use of these videos. Thanks. Bye.